Yeah, thank you, Evans. And this panel is Singing the Undersung, singing the praises of works you may not have heard of but should have. And when we were talking over topic ideas, another runner-up was folklore, myth, and traditions utilized in today's narratives. So some of our discussion may veer off into that area as well, I hope. I will start by introducing our panelists. The far end of the table, Henry Lien, is a 2012 graduate of Clarion West. He is the author of Pea Sprout Chen middle grade fantasy series, which just happens to be my daughter's favorite books, and Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird, The Art of Eastern Storytelling, forthcoming at W.W. Norton. His short fiction has appeared in publications like Asimov's, earning multiple Nebula Award nominations. Born in Taiwan, Henry currently lives in Hollywood, California. His favorite topics include Wu Yu, a sport he created, combining kung fu and figure skating, the Imperial Court eunuchs, earthquakes, grand dams of the Gilded Age, underwater gardening, and how to talk to dolphins. All right. Emily Jiang is a writer and composer, the author of Summoning the Phoenix, Poems and Prose about Chinese Musical Instruments, illustrated by April Chu. She holds an MFA in creative writing from St. Mary's College in California and a BA in English from Rice University. She is a graduate of the Clarion Writers Workshop, among others. Her prose and poetry have been published in Apex Magazine, Stone Telling, Strange Horizons, Goblin Fruit, and elsewhere. Emily plays in a piano trio and sings with the award-winning Peninsula Women's Chorus and its ensemble Alla Breve. Her compositions range from art songs to chamber music to piano solo things. And finally, Jacob Weisman is the World Fantasy Award-winning editor and publisher of Tachyon Publications, which he founded in 1995. He edits many of Tachyon's titles and is the series editor of Tachyon's Hugo, Nebula, Sturgeon, and Shirley Jackson award-winning novella line. His writing has appeared in The Nation, Realms of Fantasy, the Louisville Courier Journal, the Seattle Weekly, and the Cooper Point Journal. Jacob co-authored the novella Mingus Fingers, Fairwood Press, and is rumored to be hard at work on his own first novel. So, I would like to start by asking you each for one undersung book that you particularly want to talk about and give us just the briefest introduction that you think it needs and why you think everybody should be reading it. So let's start at this end. Jacob.
Ooh, okay. This is actually not the question I was anticipating, even though it's a the crux of the panel.
Well, now I actually want to know what you anticipated.
Well, I thought we'd do a more general outline of things and what makes things underappreciated.
That's my next question.
We'll get to that. I will give you one title that is very underappreciated, almost unknown, although it was reprinted in the UK a couple of years ago, which is a book called Rax, R-A-X, by an author named Micaiah G. Coney. It's a book that I found by accident. I actually bought a lot, not a great amount, but like an auction lot of old paperbacks. And this book had the worst cover I had ever seen. I wish I had brought a copy so that I could show people how bad the American cover is. A little paperback and it was kind of beat up. And I just sort of picked it up and started reading it because, you know, it's like, well, what is this? And it's a book that should have been a classic from the early 70s. Like it should be there with like Dispossessed and all this other stuff that I, you know, grew up reading and loved. And it's basically, you know, a sort of a it's about a planet that has this long rotation around its sun, so that every 60 or 80 years, the winter gets so cold that everyone has to go underground, and there's only so much resources to go around, so not everyone gets to go underground. They've all sort of forgotten that this, because it's so long that it takes place, and so the book is actually like this love story between these two aliens who are growing up. So it's a story of young love, and then there's this background that's almost like the Cold War parallel, that's just breathtaking, that seeps in slowly through the narrative. You know, it's not until the end you realize just how large all the stakes are to the book.
Wow.
And Michael Coney is an odd writer in that almost every book he wrote was kind of different. So, you know, even among his books, there's nothing really like this book. And it's just a breathtaking book, and it has a small following in the UK, and it was brought out about 10 years ago, along with the sequel that had never been published. So
was the sequel any good?
It was good. It wasn't the same, and we changed a lot of sort of the details of how everything worked. So it was a very different work. I enjoyed it, but you know, definitely, if you are so inclined to track this book down, don't only read the sequel if you love the first book.
Okay, Rats, Michael G. Coney. Emily.
Okay, I was also not sure, because I have a lot of books, and it's hard to say to a large audience of very individualized tastes and individualized backgrounds and individualized everything, what everyone should read. That's hard for me to say, but I'm gonna try, which I think for an English-speaking audience, I'm changing my thing as I go right now. For an English-speaking audience, I think read internationally, and for myth, the ultimate. I'm curious, who here knows the Monkey King? Great. So we're the Bay Area, and a lot of people know the Monkey King in the Bay Area, thankfully, but it was not the case 10 years ago for sure. And I think in order to do effective retellings, you have to retell a story that your mainstream reader will understand and know. And so if you're trying to tell a retelling of a Chinese myth that no one's heard about, no one's going to be able to tell what's the original versus the retelling. So I think we should all read more internationally and more about what's a common zeitgeist. So like the Monkey King is the most, for those of you who don't know, because it was about half the room. For those of you who don't know, the Monkey King is perhaps arguably the most famous Chinese novel on the planet, and it was originally written centuries ago and has been translated into many narratives in China and Southeast Asia and Japan and Korea. I mean, it's ubiquitous. If you know Dragon Ball Z, that is a Monkey King, you know. Dragon Ball Z is awesome. But you know, there's just many retellings of that, so I highly recommend check it out. Yeah. And he's a trickster character too. So if you love trickster characters, that's the other thing. If you love trickster characters, you will love the Monkey King. If you don't love trickster characters, you might kind of hate the Monkey King. You know, I had a love-hate relationship with him when I was young because I did not enjoy trickster characters until I was an adult. And so I didn't understand why he was misbehaving the whole time and getting into trouble, as one does when you're an interesting trickster protagonist. But anyway, so that's you know, my general thing. So that we can do more retellings of Monkey King and people will get it.
Right. Monkey King.
I did on the Monkey King. There's a fantastic Audible version that just came out. I've read maybe 4 different versions of the Monkey King. The Audible version is actually the best abridged version. The Monkey King is like what, 3,000 words. The original is massive. So every version that we get in English is an abridged version. Yeah, the one that came out on Audible is the best one I've ever come across. It's got a great performance, great selections of types of anecdotes within the larger book that are very representative of all the stories in the Monkey King. But the best thing is that at the heart of the Monkey King, there's this incredibly subversive, anti-religion premise, and I won't spoil, but it's expurgated out of almost every version that comes into English, and it's just this one paragraph. But it knocks the foundations out from all of Buddhism, and is preserved in this version. So I would absolutely ditto the Monkey King as a recommendation. I would start with the Audible version that just came out like 2 years ago. Fantastic.
Okay.
But that's not my recommendation. Let me get a feel of the room. Who has heard of Shantan?
Yes.
Okay, a few. Who has heard of Lien? Okay, all right, about equal. I'm gonna go with Shantan. Okay, so Shantan is not unknown. He's a superstar in children's literature, but everybody should be reading Shantan. He's a Chinese-Australian author illustrator, and the book that I recommend that you start with is his masterpiece, and it's called The Arrival. And anyone know The Arrival?
Different from Ted Chiang's Arrival.
Oh, yes.
Very different
Yes.
from Ted Chiang.
Who knows The Arrival? Shantan has The Arrival? Okay, all right. So Shantan, Shauntan, Shantan. Okay, so The Arrival is this wordless book. And it's done in these paintings. I think they are watercolors, and they're done in this sepia style so that they look like old photographs. And as you start opening the book, you're looking for cultural markers of when and where this is. And it looks from the clothing like this might be early 20th century, and it might be Eastern Europe, but the face of the main character is racially ambiguous, and it's actually Shantan himself, and he's biracial. But so he goes along, and it looks like he's embarking upon this classic story of immigration through Ellis Island. But then there are some little surrealist details that come in that make you just realize that something's a little bit off. And then they arrive at this destination location when we fully expect New York, and we see the grand vista of this city, and it is very much not New York. I mean, there are these giant sculptures that look like children's toys, and these flowers that look like lollipops, and these strange animals that look like origami hamster birds. So everything is different about it. And then you realize that this is not a historical novel. This is absolutely a fantasy novel, but it is wordless, and we are very much immersed in the viewpoint of that main character. And as he arrives and goes through the analog of immigration, he gets tested physically, and he has to read signs, and the signs are as incomprehensible to us as they are to him. And then he is allowed into the city, and he's got one small task, and that's to find lodging for the night. And it becomes this grand mission because everything in the city is different. The writing system is completely different. The ticket booths look like telephone booths. There are instructions on the ground. Strange fruits and animals that we've never seen before, and everybody's got an animal. This is an animal-loving city. So everything is a little intimidating because it is so unfamiliar. And eventually he is able to find his way into the city, find some foundation in the city, build a life in the city. And you cheer for him when he does. And the reason you cheer for him is because the author has launched him into a world that has no discernible analog with an existing culture or language or visual idiom. It is so original that every reader gets the experience of what it's like to be an immigrant, which I think is a critical life experience, to be completely lost. But unlike most immigrant tales, it's not cynical, it's not pessimistic, it's not about hardship. It is about those things, but not exclusively. It's also about kindness. And that's very much at the heart of all of Shantan's works. The hand that reaches out when you are at your lowest is one of the most precious gifts we will ever experience. And if you have never been lost, if you've never been an outsider, never been a foreigner, you are denied that critical life experience. So that is why that book is so powerful. It gives everybody the gift of knowing what it's like to be an immigrant. And here's the test of how effective that book is. My father first came to the United States, actually to this area, to Berkeley, before the rest of our family came over from Taiwan. And he bore the brunt of that immigration experience and didn't really speak English, had a high school education, $200 in the bank, I think. And he was working illegally, washing dishes in a Chinese restaurant under the table until he got his work permit. So he had an analogous personal life experience. And he is not really a reader, certainly not a children's book reader, certainly not an illustrated children's book. So I gave him this book and I said, Dad, will you read this? And he said, what is this? I said, just read it and tell me what you think. And so he took it and I had lunch with him the following week. And he brought the book and just handed it back to me. And he's not a man of many words. So I knew I had to kind of pry it out of him. And I said, okay, well, did you read it? He said, yes. And I said, okay, well, what did you think of it? And he said, this is exactly how it was for me. So that is a testament to how powerful and how universal Sean Tan's work is, even though it is so incredibly specific. He gets to the universal experience through this incredibly specific world building. And I've gone on for too long, but I will just say one last thing. The publisher and editor of Sean Tan is Arthur Levine, who was also the publisher and editor of Harry Potter.
He brought Harry Potter to the United States.
Right, yeah. And he's an acquaintance of mine. And I emailed him after I read the latest Sean Tan book, not The Arrival. There were several after that, but I said, you know, Arthur, I figured out what it is about Sean Tan that I love. Every time I read a new Sean Tan book, I am slightly, but permanently, a better person. And that's pretty high praise for him. So Sean Tan's The Arrival.
You know, Jacob, you had a question in mind, and I liked it. So can you repeat the question and then answer it?
Well, let me just do the answer.
Okay.
I think the question is a little more amorphous, but it's just the idea that books are unknown for different reasons and sort of in different categories, right? There are works that used to be popular that have fallen out of favor. There are works that have never been popular. There are works that are popular, but for whatever reason, you know, I or groups of people have yet to encounter them, have yet to read them. And so these are all the kind of reasons why something might need to be read. And so it's not just the obscurity per se, although it could be. You know, I started with the most obscure book I could think of. But there's also just, you know, when I started started my company like 30 years ago, and one of the first conventions I went to, they had something called the Fan Olympics, and one of the challenges they gave the people, so kind of like this, was that they had, okay, we're going to read you the first line of the story, and you know, you need to answer with the last line of the same story. And I was blown away, and I was like, oh my God. I went up to Tom Whitmore, who I knew, who used to run Other Chamber Hobbit House here in Berkeley. And I said, well, how do you do that? He's like, well, you have to remember, when I grew up, there weren't that many stories published. And so, you know, there are fewer stories that had memorable first lines, and even fewer stories that had memorable last lines that had memorable first lines. So there was a very small pool of possibilities that these could be, and so, you know, we knew them. And you know, science fiction kind of has that trajectory in general, where if you go back to like 1960, and maybe there was 50 to 100 books published in a year. Now there's like 2,000. So there's a period where everyone would read the same books. And, you know, even if your thing was like, I really like vampires, well, there'd be like 3 or 4 of those, and then you'd have to read all the other stuff, sort of, because that's what there was to read. And so everyone had a sort of shared experience of what science fiction was and what were the important works. And now everything is very diffuse. And so, you know, what any of us know is very sort of random. And we rely on word of mouth and all kinds of stuff to try to figure out what we should read, which is why we're on this panel and in this room. But it also means that something that is very popular, you know, I might not know and might not have gotten to, and I need to know why I need to read that. You know, as well as, you know, there was this book that everyone used to read and no one reads it now, or, you know, no one's ever read this thing, but it has, you know, it has a very strong undercurrent of following. You know, if you want to understand all the stuff around it, that's the book you need to read. So that's what I'm saying.
Okay. Thank you. So you two can also expand on the same question, but something else that I'm wanting to touch on in this discussion is the role of personal taste in making recommendations and the value of owning and declaring personal taste. And so, you know, in current publishing industry, there's drive, especially by big publishers, to sell as many units as possible, and therefore to publish books with the widest appeal. And some of those are great books, but also there's a lot of mediocrity sweeping through publishing industry in this effort to find something that appeals to everybody. Whereas, you know, the small presses and the brave publishers are exerting their personal taste in choosing what to publish, sometimes at risk of not selling many units. And so, as Emily, if you're ready, as you continue talking about kind of the basis of undersung books and how books fall below the radar, I'd love for you also to reflect on the role of outspoken personal taste in getting word out about books.
Yeah, I think it really depends. Where again, I want to emphasize how reading is such a personalized, individual activity. And the same book spark joy for one person and then just being that, or ugh for another person. And so I hesitate strongly, but there were things I was thinking about, like, why do we read? What do we get out? How do we find pleasure? Because we're reading for pleasure, right? For this, and we're not always reading for information when we read fiction. And so I think that, you know, it could be the world. You know, some people are really into like interesting, intricately created worlds. Lord of the Rings would be a good one for you, because he basically created a world so he can use his language. You know, like, you know, I mean, so his world is incredibly intricately created. If you want a character, a certain type of character, a certain archetype that you love, like the very popular orphaned hero or heroine, or, you know, protagonist, underdog, who then does a building romance and becomes, you know, the ultimate power and savior of their planet or their country or wherever the setting is. That can be something that you really, you know, can speak to as well. And I also find that a lot of people react, especially in critique, when we get critique feedback. So these are the comments These are where they're strong. If they're a world builder, they'll tell you about the world and how you have, poke holes in the world. If they're a character-driven interiority person, they're gonna tell you like this, I don't believe this about the character, this is where you need to flesh out your character, okay, cool. And then like the language people, right, the sentence structure people who are super into just beautifully constructed sentences, and they're all about that and the detail and the rhythm, the flow, and some of them could be trained poets. So you have those folks, and for those folks, I would recommend Lien. I would recommend Patricia Phillip. I mean, people who are just so into like gorgeous sounding language. And so those are kind of how I categorize. Or like, I'm like, oh, you like William Gibson? We're probably gonna like that Paula particularly, because I think, Paula's kind of in that same vein of responding to what William had written. Or if you love Tamara Pierce, and especially, her a lot of their first venture books, especially the sword and sorcery stuff, you're gonna love Kristen Kishore's books, because to me, Kristen Kishore is Tamara Pierce 2.0, the next generation. So like there's these lineages of what I think some authors are just really responding to, that, if you love the, for whatever reason, this aspect of this author, you're gonna love this other author. And the other one is if you love Patricia McKillop, or Robin McKinley, I should say. Robin McKinley, they're very different. But to me, they have very lush language and such. If you love Robin McKinley, you're gonna really love Shannon Hale, who I met and said, she's like, I'm such a fan of Robin McKinley. I'm like, yes, me too. And Patricia McKillop too, I think. And so you're gonna wanna like kind of group it that way. So that's why I hesitate to say one book. But like the other one would be like the Bible. If you're not Christian, there's so much, like there's so many biblical references throughout our English related literature, English originated literature that reference the Bible, that if or Greek and classical, Greek and Roman mythology, that if you don't have that context, you're missing a lot. And so just some basic things that I feel, because and this is another thing I'd like to address later after Henry finishes his thing, which is like, what are the components of how do you retell something and make it fresh sounding? Because we were going to talk a little bit about folklore retellings as well. So, but I'll let you go.
Going to harmonize everything that's come before. I agree that taste, it is hard to account for taste, but I also think that taste does trump everything, and I think that is a good and a bad thing. I mean, we all have the things that we are judging not by merit, but just because it happens to be the subject that we find closeness, and that's completely fine. But I also think that taste, literary taste, aesthetic tastes are like culinary tastes, and they are transmitted, and they are transmitted to us when we don't even realize they're being transmitted to us. So I think that it's important, like it is important to try different types of foods, it's important to try things that don't sound like they are your thing. And I am very interested in the ways that Western books are constructed versus non-Western storytelling. My next book coming out, which you mentioned, is called Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird, the Art of Eastern Storytelling. And it's coming up next year. But it's very much about this idea that things that we think are universal, like the hero's journey, like rising self-esteem marks, like characters finding themselves, like characters empowering themselves. These represent like 95+% of all books published in the West. And there's reason for that. They are nutritive and they can even save lives, but they are not the only game in town. And if you look at non-Western storytelling, particularly East Asian storytelling, particularly the 4-act structure, most known in the West by the Japanese name Kisho Tenketsu, it is radically different because its values are different. Who has seen the film Parasite? Yay! Okay, all right. Parasite Trojan horsed this 4-act structure into American audiences. And American audiences love Parasite. Parasite swept the Oscars. First foreign language film to win Best Picture. But Parasite is told in a radically different form. So the East Asian 4-act structure, the Western 3-act structure has some core values, and one of them is symmetry. You've got to introduce the main issue or problem at the beginning, and it's got to be resolved to some extent by the end. Similarly, you've got to introduce all the main elements, all the main characters in the first act, and they should make an appearance at the end. You don't want Darth Vader to appear at the beginning of Star Wars and then just disappear from the ending of the movie. Similarly, you don't want Darth Vader to appear for the first time at the end of the movie. So say that came from nowhere. That idea of symmetry is very baked into Western aesthetics of what makes for a satisfying story.
It's a little bit from like Anton Chekhov, if you put it done in the first act.
Yeah.
Use it by the end.
Yeah. Well, people say you didn't fire the gun. You didn't finish the story. The pregnant woman didn't pop the baby. We want to see that symmetry. And the East Asian 4-act structure is quite deliberately different. A defining convention of this 4-act structure is you deliberately hold back one of the main elements until after the halfway point, and then you drop it on the story like an asteroid, and then watch the chaos that happens and watch the characters try to reestablish equilibrium or find some invisible relationship among these things that came. So I'm not going to spoil Parasite for any of those who have not seen it, but yeah, you absolutely see it. But you know that after the halfway point, something new happens. A new thing enters into the story, and it creates absolute chaos, and we don't know who the heroes are or the villains anymore. It creates absolute chaos, and then the rest of the film is those characters trying to reestablish equilibrium with relationship to each other. This is classic Kisho Tenketsu, and you'll find it in Mario games. You'll find it in many Nintendo games. This structure where the rules are set up, and then boom, new thing comes in, and you got to figure out how am I going to use this new thing. So it seems like a really weird structure where you deliberately hold back something critical to your story, like the thing that was found in Parasite, what they found in the house. That you know most there are things that most Western students would say, "Whoa, why are you waiting? This is the critical part of the story. It's got to be there because we need to know how to feel about it way early on. This is crappy storytelling." It's not. It's just a different aesthetic, and the reason for this aesthetic is it's not about. Okay, aesthetic tastes are informed by cultural values, and I hate to speak in generalizations, but I do it nonstop, so I'm not going to stop now. In general, Western cultures value individualism more than collectivism, and East Asian cultures value collectivism more than individualism. So that knowing that, a structure where you've got elements or characters, and they have their relationship throughout half of the story, and then boom, something or someone new comes in. And everybody is rocking from the impact of that asteroid, but you have to find what is the relationship. How do you feel about this new thing? And create a new community, a new collective unit that includes this unwelcome surprise in the third act. And that is very much a collectivist viewpoint. How do we create equilibrium among the unit, even when it is invaded halfway through the story after we got very comfortable? So that is how this story structure arose, and it is radically different. And I think that taste does trump all, but I also think that you can find you like different types of things. You can find you love Ethiopian vegan food that you never tried it before, but then somebody slips it onto your plate. You're like, oh my God, what is this? That's absolutely what happened with Parasite. That's absolutely what happened with Nintendo games. They Trojan horse these radically different forms informed by radically different values onto your plate, and you said, yum. So I'm a big fan of going out, of acknowledging that taste trumps all. We have our cozy and guilty pleasures, but also being open to something new appearing in front of us. Thank you. I agree.
All right, so the question to do pose is, how do you retell something and make it fresh?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for remembering that. So I wanted to quote a rather problematic quote by an author named Murati Mukherjee, who's no longer with us, but she was one of the original early Iowa Writer Workshop graduates. And for those of you who don't know about Iowa Workshop, it's like the best literary writers workshop and most prestigious writers workshop in the United States of America, usually focusing on very realistic fiction. But it has changed since then. I think now that science fiction and fantasy or speculative fiction is more mainstream. There's a lot of other people who come out of Iowa who have a strong background in writing speculative. But Bharati Mukherjee, she taught at Berkeley, and I went to a lecture of hers at Berkeley, and she said that the idea of fiction, when you write fiction, you want to either make the familiar exotic or the exotic familiar. At first I cringed because I'm like, she used the E word. I was just like, I couldn't believe she as an Asian woman would use the E word, but she's of another generation. But even so, she's E word. But I thought about, is there another word that would replace exotic perfectly? And there is none. Because to make the familiar exotic means it's different, but like in a seductive way. And to make the exotic familiar, say the other familiar or different familiar, it's not the same. It's not the same when you would try to replace that word with other words. So I'm using that, but I'm also letting you know I don't necessarily approve of the word. But that's kind of what you do. And so when you take something familiar, like a folk tale, a myth, a legend, you want to twist it a little bit to make it a little bit unfamiliar, a little bit exotic. And there are many ways you can do this. And I'm going to use Cinderella as the example because it is like one of the most famous internationally fairy tales out there and one of the oldest ones out there. The easiest way to do it would be to change your setting. Setting being not only the place, but also the time period. So you could do contemporary retelling of Cinderella. One that I saw that, and again, I'm going to do mostly YA stuff, guys. That's mostly what I read. So hopefully, and I encourage you all to read YA because it's like awesome now. Like it's not the same as it was maybe, many, many, many years ago. Geekerella by Ashley Fuston. Trigger warning, I have not read this one yet. It's on my to-read list, but the premise is amazing because it's set in contemporary American times. She's a geek and she enters a cosplay contest and she's Cinderella and she meets her Prince Charming in a cosplay contest. So I'm kind of like, this sounds amazing and it's all about fandom. And so I think it would probably be incredibly compelling for our people of our background. If you wanted to change the place and the time, Donna Jo Napoli, who's a linguist at Swarthmore, amazing, one of my favorite writers for YA because she likes to do the retellings and placing historically accurate settings with the level of detail that you're like, she's done her research on this. And they're not nearly as fantastical as they would be, but she took the Cinderella fairy tale and gave it the original Chinese, the oldest Cinderella's, many of you maybe know as Chinese. So she put it in China, and she had a lot of those like details of ancient culture. You feel very immersed into it. And even though there are slight magic realism elements in it, it feels more like historical fiction, and it's one of my favorite retellings of Cinderella.
I'm just gonna comment on that. That is a great book, and one of the things I loved about its take on Cinderella was it embraces the historical practice of foot binding as a major theme. And of course, in the original that we have in the West, the shape and length of the foot was critical for both Cinderella and her sister. So it absolutely understood that.
Right. So like, for those of you who don't know about foot binding, I've done a little bit of research on how does one bind your foot? First of all, you have to be very young. You have to be like a toddler or younger. You basically take your foot and they take your toes and they basically crack your bone, your metatarsal, and they take your toes and they bound it underneath so that your toes are underneath your heel, basically, and then you're kind of like tiptoeing, and they have to like massage the foot with herbs and wrap it and unwrap it every day, wrap it a little bit tighter every day. It is a horrific process, but that's how they do it. And so then and again, foot binding back in those days up until like 1908 or 1906 when it was outlawed in China. If you had the luxury of having bound foot as a female, that meant that you were of upper class and therefore very beautiful and considered very desirable. Bound feet were considered very desirable and beautiful because it meant you were of high class and you didn't have to work in the rice paddies or do any manual labor because you couldn't barely walk, And so, yeah, it's a horrific but fascinating way that we cripple our bodies for the sake of beauty, which is actually for the sake of, power.
Can you say the author? Yeah.
Oh, Donna Jo Napoli, Napoli, excuse me. Yeah, she's Italian American, and she has some really great retellings that are not just Cinderella. What was the book? Bound. Oh, Bound.
Just one point about that and about bound in that my grandmother actually had bound feet.
Really?
Yeah. And I'm not that old.
It was outlawed in 1906 or 1908, but people still did it
Yeah.
anyways.
And the thing is, it was not limited only to the rich, because like with any kind of beauty standard, it becomes aspirational for all classes to adopt whatever the rich felt was beautiful. And my grandmother was an illiterate peasant, and so she did have to work in the rice fields
With bound feet?
with bound feet. And part of what I liked about the Napoli book is that she showed that this is not these practices do end up spreading insidiously throughout all levels of society.
Right, yeah, because we always want to be of that upper class. So, yeah, anywho. So that was the setting. So you change the setting, and again, the uses of the objects in Cinderella change. Like we think of now the glass slipper because Disney kind of iconified it, but that's really a very recent, in the past couple 100-year invention. Before the glass slipper, which was originally Charles Perrault in France put it in his anthology, there was the golden slipper by Grimm, and before the golden slipper, the bound one was just an embroidered slipper, And so, and also like who the fairy godmother is changed as well. Like again, Charles Perrault made it an actual fairy godmother like person. But in Grimm in Germany, it was a tree, because it was a tree that sprouted from Cinderella's dead mother's grave and gave her dresses and whatnot and her slippers and whatnot. And then in China, it was a fish that Ye Shen, who was the Cinderella then, basically caught and raised into this beautiful koi fish, which in ancient China was a symbol of good luck, because if you could eat fish, it was a symbol of good luck and money and wealth. And so if you had koi fish, fat koi fish in your pond, it was like you were prosperous. And so another way you can retell an old story to give it a new spin is you take your protagonist and you give it a unique, fresh characteristic that perhaps wasn't in previous iterations. So for example, Bella Enchanted, another famous one.
I love that one.
It's so good, right? So I heard Gail Carson Levine talk about this. She's very Jewish from New York, by the way. And she was like, I can't understand why Cinderella was so obedient. Like it doesn't make any sense to me. And so for me to make it make sense to me, I had to make her cursed into obedience, basically. And that was the only logical reason that I could find that any girl would be so obedient to people who treated her so terribly. And I thought that was kind of brilliant and amazing. Melinda Lowe wrote Ash. Her first novel was Ash. She nods. And she says it's the first lesbian Cinderella. I'm gonna just trust her on that. There have been others since, I'm sure, but like she wrote it a while ago, published a while ago. It's her first novel, and she claimed it's her first lesbian Cinderella. And then Cinder by Marissa Meyer is again it's set in the future, 200 years from now in New Beijing, and Cinderella there is a cyborg, and so it does really cool, interesting things in the future. So, so again, you can make your protagonist, give them something that differentiates them from all the other iterations that that have preceded them. And what I find is the trend for the past 10 years in YA for fairy tale and folktale retellings is we're doing a lot of like children of or next generation retellings. And I think it's probably influenced by Once Upon a Time. Like I was like, why are there so many? Because there weren't that many prior. Like I just recently started diving back into children's and YA after a hiatus about 8 years. There weren't that many before. And I think it is probably due to Once Upon a Time, the ABC series, which is like my dream job of, if I could have been a writer for that, I would have been like in heaven. But anyways, so yeah.
Open it up for.
Oh, sorry.
questions. Can you, I wanna hear what was the last thing?
The
you asked?
last thing,
Yes, please.
okay, take the main character, your point of view character, take a minor character in the story and make that your point of view character. So what's the adage that every antagonist is the protagonist in their own story? So do that. So Greg Micaiah did it before Wicked. He did the Wicked Witch of the West, made her the protagonist. And the Confessions of an Evil Stepsister was also. So that was it.
Oh, no, this is
Keep on,
wonderful.
like I
Thank you.
just, yeah, I'm gonna just talk forever. I'll stop. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from?
There is one
the
question,
outside world?
asking people to maybe recap some of the recommendations. You might want to hold that to the end.
All right. Any questions from this audience?
In the back.
Yes, for Emily Jiang, now you're talking about, just literally the last thing you said about a recent trend, a whole lot of, children of next generation fairy tale, stuff, mythology, folklore and whatnot. My first thought was actually Rick Riordan, the Percy Jackson
Yes.
series, you think?
Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
I was wondering if that might be the progenitor of the thread.
He follows, in my mind, Harry Potter.
Oh,
He follows very closely to Harry Potter because he got published closely, really like after. And his hook is brilliant, so brilliant. I don't know if you've heard him speak. I've heard him speak, and he's amazing, very charismatic speaker. His hook was, what if in our contemporary world the Greek gods were still alive, and what if they were still sleeping around with humans and having demigods? And what if, in order to figure out if you're a demigod, that you had to like. You had to like be able to read ancient Greek, and so that gives you dyslexia. And what if, because you're going to be a target when you come of age into your powers and your teenage years, the monsters just stop coming for you. You have to also have ADHD, so you have to be super like that. Again, it's a little not what we know of these especially ADHD, but like this was written 10 years ago. So what it was very much back then. It kind of blew my mind because I was like, this was the first time I had seen a hero that was centered who had dyslexia and ADHD, and was like, and it was a super powerful thing for them, and it made them. It was kind of like a DC comic book hero where your superpowers make you a hero and make you amazing. Unlike the Marvel heroes where your superpowers kind of are a source of your angst and pain. But we can go into that later. We can go into that later if you want to talk to me about that. The DC versus Marvel thing, please talk to me later about that.
I see another hand.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is the way that genre really, that when something splits a genre, it can make really easy for that story to get lost because where do you put it on the bookshelf, right? Where do they, and so if it has the wrong cover, or if it has, because they try to sell it one way, when really it's another kind of story. And so I'm just interested in your thinking about undersung or unsung stories with the lens of like of being kind of difficult to define as far as genre goes.
All right, we've got 2 minutes. Sorry, was that directed to anyone in particular?
I'd be directed to you.
Well, that's always a problem. I mean,
Right.
it's more about, that comes down to marketing, right? It's like, you have a book, as a publisher, which I am, and you have to figure out how to reach the audience for that book. And that means putting the right kind of cover on the book. It means putting the right kind of advertising copy. It means getting that book out to the right people who will read it. And if you fail at that, you will not reach your target audience. And books, are returnable, which means that you really get like, at least traditionally in stores, things are getting to be a little different. Stores, generally only carry a book for 3 months, and so things can sink very quickly and, not reappear. And sometimes they reappear later and sometimes they don't.
Okay, to add on to the online question, if you have any recommendations for books that you love that don't fit a genre, I'd love to hear them.
Okay, it's lightning recommendations.
Einstein's Dreams by Alan Kurzweil.
So I've just been talking a lot.
Well, I don't really have anything that necessarily fits the genre, but some of my favorite books. Bernard Wolfe wrote a book called Limbo in the 1950s, which is a very odd, very unusual book. He was not really a science fiction writer, but every once in a while wrote something. Tachyon has a book out a couple months ago, Samantha Mills, The Wings Upon Her Back, which I think is going to be a big book next year that you'll be reading about, especially when the awards nominations start coming out. You should get ahead of that and check it out. But this stuff changes all the time. If we had done this panel 30, 40 years ago, I'd be telling you to read Philip K. Dick and Octavia Butler.
Right.
And they're now household names. And the people are reading then, some of them are and some of them aren't. And it really is going to, it churns and it keeps going. And
I'd also like to volunteer one of another Tachyon book, which is the Bird Pierce books by R.B. Lindbergh. The first one of which
Four Profound Leaves.
Four Profound Leaves. It's their world building is really spectacular, and they are also a linguist, and their language is also spectacular. So you've got a really dense, engaging read in those two novellas. And also read Henry's book. The Pete Proud books. I'm just like in love with the public, in love with the concept and just everything. Yeah. What was it? The New York Times said it was a cross between, and that's the other thing that you have to do now as an author. You have to know your comps, who your competition is, which is another way you can kind of figure out where your marketing would be. But it's a cross between Crouching Tiger and
Hermione Granger meets Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Escapades meets Mean Girl.
Yeah. Guys, I highly recommend that.
Let's see, we do have a couple more minutes. I was just reading my clock before and I saw a hand in the front. Were you raising your hand? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I see another hand in the back.
Sorry, just a question. Wow, I had a sentence when I started.
It's all good.
Question for Ms. Lien. The 4-act structure thing you mentioned sounded really interesting. Could you repeat the name of that?
Just look up East Asian 4-act structure. You'll find very few, if any, books in English on it, which is why I was asked by Norton to write this book. There are plenty of articles. You'll see these wonderful analyses on YouTube applying the 4-act structure to Japanese cartoons. Japanese manga, if you read manga, there's the quick 4-panel manga. It is absolutely the best way to learn about this structure. But just look up East Asian 4-act structure. There's plenty out there, but there are no books. So buy my book.
Should also point out that a lot of science fiction doesn't actually follow the 3-act structure. A lot of science fiction, it's not the 4-act structure necessarily, but the way writers can build a lot of tension in science fiction by the way the information is dispersed in the book. So it's, when you're immersed into a new world, it's very hard for the author to give you everything about that world right away, so you're gonna be gradually introduced to where you are, who people are, and what's going on, and very often key information in the science fiction book or a fantasy book is left out, and that actually creates tension has nothing to do with the pre-act structure.
Yeah, and I absolutely applaud that, but there is this dire gravity of wisdom among gatekeepers about, you know, what has to be done. You're always trying to fight to escape that gravity.
This is the narrow definition of the stories than just the one story.
Yeah.
They're
Now,
the
the
same
Hollywood
story.
sticks very close to the book.
So does YA though, so does middle grade.
Read it,
Alright.
yeah.
Oh, I love
Okay,
MTN.
good, yeah, he's amazing. He's another one if you haven't read him. I find him to have written some of the most thought-provoking science fiction for younger readers. And like Feed, it's been like, what, over 15 years and it still applies today. So yeah, MTN is fabulous. Anything that is- And I'll, for the chat, I'll just type in whatever I was talking, just to save time.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, audience.